This week, we welcome Mathieu Gorge, Chief Executive Officer at Vigitrust, to discuss the cyber elephant in the boardroom, cyber accountability with the 5 pillars of security framework. In the leadership and communication section, outgunned CISOs navigate complex obstacles to keep rising attacks from turning into breaches, how to write a cyber threat report executives can really use, creating and rolling out an effective cybersecurity strategy, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Stopping advanced threats requires knowing exactly what you're up against. Extra Hop Reveal X is the only solution that shows you not just where intruders are going, but where they've been. 90-day look back and complete network visibility across the data center, cloud, and device edge help security teams respond 84% faster with Extra Hop Reveal X network detection and response. Explore the interactive demo at securityweekly.com/extrahop.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 214, recorded April 26, 2021. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado. Paul is on vacation, which means both of my co-hosts are joining remotely today. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, Matt. Great to be here. I'm a little jealous of Paul.
And I know, he's in Florida, nice and warm. Yeah. And filling in for Paul today is Adrian Sanabria. Welcome, Adrian.
How you doing, Matt? How you doing, Jason? Also jealous of Paul.
It is warm in Colorado today, but I have snow in the forecast for Wednesday, so it's not going to last long. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch. Our next live webcast will be on April 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where you'll learn how to prepare for and prevent modern ransomware attacks. Our next technical training will be on March 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern. This technical training webcast will explore common misconfigurations of NGINX, the damage they do, and how to avoid them. Also join us May 13th, also at 11 a.m. Eastern, for a technical training with Thycotic to see how attackers gain access to endpoints and learn defensive strategies to protect against those attacks. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register now. If you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Mathieu Gorge is an established authority on data security, risk management, and compliance with more than 20 years global experience. Mathieu is a PCI DSS, data security standard, and data security expert. Since 2006, Mathieu has been a counselor for Ireland's French Chamber of Commerce, for which he also acts as its president. In 2014, he was appointed French Trade Foreign Advisor by the French government. He also works closely with the PCI Council in both the United States and the European Union. Mathieu, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Now, I love the French accent. I did take 3 years of French, but don't ask me to remember much of it, outside of like bonjour and a few other things. That'll be about it today. We're going to talk about your book, Mathieu, The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom. And I want to start first with kind of the backstory on why the book. I always like I like people to kind of tell the story when they write a book. Like, what motivated you to write a book?
Yeah, so I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years. I started at my career in sales, selling network security, content security. Then I created Vigitrust. We started out doing pretty much the same value-added reseller. Then we started doing face-to-face training around data privacy, which logically led us to doing a number of assessments. And then fast forward to 2012, we productized our training into an e-learning platform. And fast forward to today, we have a tool called VG1, which is an integrated risk management tool that allows you to prepare for, validate, and manage continuous compliance with about 100 security frameworks and standards. And so my view when I started the business was that I needed to have some sort of a safety net in case something didn't go well with the business. And so I started speaking at a number of conferences. And as I was meeting a lot of very good people, very intelligent people in security, I thought that networking was really important. And so I decided to create a global advisory board, bringing together CISOs, board members, regulators, law enforcement, researchers, and indeed people that write books around cyber in a non-commercial think tank under Chatham House rules. And so 10 years ago, the Global Advisory Board was born, and a number of folks within the advisory board said to me, well, we heard about that methodology that you created called the 5 Pillars of Security Framework, to talk to the board and to C-level folks around cyber. Maybe you should write a book about that. So that's how the book came about.
Great. It's always fun to have your peers recommend to you to write a book. And it sounds like you came up with a methodology of how to approach it. But before we get to the 5 pillars, because I do want to talk about those 5 pillars, as we think about, and we've covered this on this show, right? That security is a risk management decision. It belongs in the boardroom. It requires buy-in across the different business units. I mean, we have to think about security as a business enabler, not as a cost center. And so when you look at from the time you started writing the book till now, or even a little further back, what kind of trends or shifts are we seeing in the boardroom? We cover stories here that, yes, it's getting more coverage in the boardroom, but how big is the gap still?
So I think it's worth remembering that 5 years ago or 6 years ago, cyber was rarely making it to the boardroom, right? So cyber was more a discussion for the server room rather than the boardroom. Cyber was a discussion that potentially would make it to an IT strategy meeting, potentially would be discussed with marketing people or digital transformation people at some stage if you were lucky, but not really at the board level. And so we've seen a shift really since GDPR, actually since 2018, the concept of cyber accountability has been brought to the attention of the board. And whilst it had been brought there many times before, it was suddenly getting teeth, right? So potentially the idea that this was an extraterritorial regulation that could touch you anywhere in the world, as long as you had data that was covered by GDPR, suddenly got at least a lot of legal people thinking, who then brought that up to the board of directors. But to your point is it really getting the attention that it needs to get? I contend that it's not. I think it's going the right direction, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, GDPR is a great enabler in the European Union, but we don't have those equivalents here. I mean, we've got CCPA in California. Virginia just passed a privacy law. There's nothing at kind of the national level. I mean, we can talk regulations all day long, right? So Graham Leach Bliley in the financial space, check. PCI for the credit card, check. HIPAA for healthcare, check. But those are industry-based kind of discussions. GDPR did something in the European Union that I don't think we've done here in the States, which is kind of a more global framework around privacy, which made it more of a requirement to think about cyber accountability at the board. Here, we have it kind of hit or miss depending on which industry you're in. And I think that's the biggest challenge here in the States.
Yeah, I would agree, Matt. I mean, it is in pockets and industries, right? Because I would say most technology companies, cybersecurity was definitely a boardroom conversation 5 years ago, right? Only because it had to be. It was the nature of our business. It's what kept us running. And if anything were to happen, it was our brand that was on the line. But again, to your point, it's such in pockets, depending on industry and what you're doing, that, having some established overarching criteria and accountability, because that's how things are going to happen, right? If there's zero accountability, there's not going to be motivation enough for things to happen organically. So I think you're right. GDPR brought that to the table, a level of accountability, which forced responsibilities onto the boards.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But the reality, though, is that if you look at PCI, it also has a requirement for somebody who's ultimately responsible for the PCI program. You find that in any kind of security framework or information security governance regulation. You also find it in many countries, not all of them, but when you go and register a business, that idea of duty of care, and what does duty of care for the directors and the principals of the business looks like. And in some, certainly in many countries in Europe and also in the US, the duty of care applies to the data that you're entrusted with. So the concept of cyber accountability doesn't necessarily need to be in a cybersecurity framework per se. It's also in other frameworks that actually govern the way businesses are run. But you're right, GDPR was a wake-up call. And to your point about CCPA, I think that, there's Virginia, as you said, has enacted something similar, and there's other states working on it. The codification of that of data privacy into state regulation, I hope, will be a bit more successful than the codification of PCI, which only made it to about 15 states. So I think that every administration in the last 20 years in the US has kind of put forward some bills to have a federal mandate. And so the Biden administration is going to do that as well. The only difference, and potentially that might work in their favor, is that now this GDPR as the counterweight, right? So the US doesn't like to be left behind. It likes to lead. And then with regards to GDPR, it is somewhat, inverted comma, one step behind. And so there's definitely a willingness to address that, to kind of rectify the balance of power, so to speak. Now, and I'm trying to be neutral here. Obviously, I'm European, but the same applies in Europe, where traditionally it was all about protecting the data. We're going to tell you how to protect the data, and if something goes wrong, you're on your own. You deal with the reputational damage and so on. Whereas in the US, historically, it was all about data breach notification. We're not going to tell you how to protect your data, but if something goes wrong, we're going to tell you what to do and what not to do. And we're seeing that convergence right now. And I think that convergence makes it to the boardroom, where they're like, okay, if we're breached, we need to know what to do. And also, okay, how do we make sure that we're not breached? And that's where the conversation starts.
Yeah, I want to unpack a couple things. Jeff and I have debated PCI for a long time. I think the challenge with PCI, in my opinion, is unless you're a level 1 merchant or a level 1 service provider, everybody else tries to figure out how to get out of PCI by scoping or minimizing scope or whatever. And I think that is a disservice to what PCI, I thought, did a really good job of, is outlining 12 areas to protect yourself. So PCI has had mixed reviews in my purview over the years, just because unless you were the biggest of the big, where you had to do the report on compliance and spend the money, you just kind of punted it, per se. The second point I want to unpack for a second is the breach of notification law. And this is what I don't want us to do in the States, because what we ended up with is 50 different breach notification laws, which makes it really hard for corporations to comply with. I don't want us to go down that privacy path. That's why I prefer, and Jason and I and Paul have talked about this before, I'd like to see something more at the national level, because then it gives everybody the same set of privacy requirements to conform with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on both parts. I mean, I see it all the time as a service provider, and ultimately not having to adhere to PCI, right? Because again, you're punting that risk. And more often than not, I see organizations do the same thing, Matt. I mean, ultimately, they want to transfer that risk anytime they get the opportunity to.
They do, and sorry. Just to add that, PCI is a great is a great benchmark to start with. And if you replace credit card holder data with personally identifiable data, and you do a search and replace within the tool, it gives you a nice kind of little benchmark with those 12 areas to get started with. But it's not a silver bullet. And yes, it would be. I totally agree with you guys that it would be better to have something that works at national level. Although from experience within Europe, that is the European level, the EU level for GDPR is the minimum benchmark, and then some countries go over and above that, which I think would happen with some states here in the US as well.
Adrian, I think you wanted to pop in there for a second.
Yeah, as tempting as it is to jump into PCI, I've spent most of my career dealing with PCI. I agree with everything said there. Yeah, my feeling has always been that it's been a bit too prescriptive, and doesn't focus as much on the outcome as I think it should. But my question was more, so two-part question. First of all, are you familiar with the recent Clubhouse kind of stuff going on with the data that was scraped out of Clubhouse? And if so, what's your feeling there? From a European perspective, it's interesting. I think maybe to get your perspective there and whether you feel like that was a feature or a breach, and how they should have handled that differently, maybe.
So I think that the issue with Clubhouse is that it's a communication platform, right? So you're going to exchange ideas, you're going to exchange data, and from a GDPR perspective, it always goes back to where did the data come from and did you get it legally? So did you either have like a legitimate interest in getting the data, or was there consent, and how was that consent managed? And then after that, how do you keep the data up to date? And do you have the ability to provide, to respond to data subject request? The challenge came up actually recently in a different context for me, where somebody was asking, what about e-discovery? Is anything on Clubhouse discoverable? And asking a number of attorneys, I got the usual answer: it depends. But the reality is that if it's data that's out there and that is part of a case, and that it can be proven that Clubhouse was actually used as a regular medium to do business, the same way as we use Teams or Google Meet or whatever, then potentially it is discoverable. And I think that we're going to see a lot of new platforms coming out where we're going to have to ask ourselves those questions, especially because of the pandemic, and we're all trying to communicate with loads of different platforms. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm doing maybe 10, 12 different meetings a day, and none of them are on the same platform. And so at the end of the day, I have my data on all of those different platforms, and I have to entrust that whoever is managing the meeting is managing the data the right way. To the point is the platform provider doing the right thing to protect the users, to protect the data? That's a great question. And I think it goes back to, was it built really quickly to address a market need, in which case the software is probably not secure? Was it built taking SDLC into account? Was it built with the right security architecture? But we're going to have to ask ourselves those questions for every new platform. So, I mean, we can pick on Clubhouse, but because it's topical right now and there's a couple of issues, but there's going to be more this year, I would contend.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about any communications platform, Adrian, right? Whether it's Zoom or Google or Teams or whatever, they're all going to fall into the same potential issue. We did interview the CEO from Wicker, Joel Wallenstrom, on Thursday last week, where they build a platform where they don't see any of the data and let the organization set up the rules on how they want to do retention and everything else, and just stay out of it altogether, which I think is a very innovative approach.
Well, and it's interesting because 10 years ago as a PCI QSA, the answer to that question, particularly in the Clubhouse case, because it's audio, is the format. You can't even chat with somebody else on it. So all the content's audio, and it's not recorded unless an actual Clubhouse member uses some means to record that data. But as a QSA, I recall this, if you had a customer that had call centers, for example, and they recorded some of those calls for reviewing later, that kind of thing. I think the answer that came back from the council, or I can't remember exactly where we got the answer from, but it was, the data had to be searchable. So the idea was either it had to be transcribed in some way, or if you had some kind of tool that allowed you to pull that sensitive data out of those audio recordings, then it was in scope. Otherwise, it wasn't in scope. And I'm not sure 10 years later that would be treated the same.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is a good point. I think that we can ask the same question of video files, though, and I was asked recently to provide comments on video security because of the recent breaches there, and what strikes me is that there's a lot of intelligence within the public domain around how you can secure an IVR system, how you can train people, how you can put in the right policies around the IVR system, but not around the video system, which can capture a lot of data, can also can be used for a biometric attack, can also be used for tracking, geolocation, and so on. And yet that seems to be outside of the scope of many assessments, which I actually think is not right. So I suppose my point is, if we are going to pick on audio recording on Clubhouse, we should probably assign the same level of emphasis to video data and the security of that data.
Yeah. No, you bring up great points. I want to talk about the 5 pillars of your security framework, right? This is, I think, really meant to help organizations at the board level where they haven't addressed cybersecurity risks to give them a little bit of a roadmap of how to do this. Let's talk about those 5 pillars.
Yeah, so the 5 pillars of security are physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security, which is your wider infrastructure. So that's your networks, your sub-networks, your remote networks, your remote workers, your third parties, fourth parties, your cloud, your applications, and then finally, crisis management. What do you do when something goes wrong? And the idea behind the 5 pillars is that it's a way to demystify cybersecurity and cyber accountability for the board and the C-level. Because if you think about your typical board member, if there's any such thing as a typical board member, but they will generally bring a lot of experience in growing a business, in M&A, in maybe in how to staff your business and so on, but they're not necessarily cybersecurity experts or legal experts. And when the CISO goes in, or the compliance people or the technical people, when they eventually make it to the board meeting, if they start talking about in 3-letter acronyms that we all love in this industry, they're going to lose them just so quickly. So what we need to do is we need to be able to speak to them in business language, in the same language as them, in my case, albeit with a French accent, but in business language that they're able to identify with. And everybody can understand physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security, and crisis management. So what I've done with the methodology is I've created 2 versions of it, which, by the way, are available in the public domain. And it's essentially a super strategic version where there's 5 questions per pillar for the board, and a strategic version that has 12 questions per pillar for the C-suite. And out of those, you get like a sense of the security posture and the security levels that the organization has. And the questions are very, very simple questions in plain English. And the answers are, instead of being like in PCI, we spoke about PCI a lot, but instead of being, is it in place, not tested, not applicable, or I use a compensating control, it's the question will go, as a board member or as a C-level member, I am 100% confident that the physical security that I put around my systems will allow me to be in compliance with XYZ. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Yes, I think so. No, I don't think so. Absolutely not. I don't know. It's not my concern, or I don't care. And this 7 is a choice of 7. And you can already imagine that if somebody says, I don't know, okay, maybe they don't know. But if somebody says, I'm not concerned, well, that might concern the security folks. Or if somebody says, I don't care, you have a red flag there, depending on which industry you're in. And so you can use that as a benchmark. And we recommend that you do that benchmark, ideally every quarter, but at the very least twice a year with the board, and then every month with the C-level, with the C-suite, because that gives you some data and some compliance intelligence in plain English, in business English, that can then be translated into actual action items and projects for the more technical people in the organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because I can guarantee you infrastructure security concerns at the board have shifted dramatically in the last 12 months during the pandemic, because now you're thinking about all your cloud providers, you're thinking about any third parties. Your infrastructure went from maybe a very controlled on-premise environment to a highly distributed environment. So, to your point, asking those questions periodically are valid because things have shifted in that time frame.
They have, and they will continue to shift. Last year, in and around mid-March, everybody went from having 10 to 20% of people working from home or traveling to sometimes 95, 99, 100% of people working from home. And so the architecture was completely changed. A lot of organizations have had to allow users to use their home devices, to connect to systems that were otherwise closed to those devices, opening up. So for the first 6 months, it was all about staying in business and, remaining in operation. And then we spent another 3 months, September to December, thinking we're going to go back to the office. So now we need to re-engineer all of that. And then in December, we understood we weren't going to go back to the office immediately. And so we had to say, okay, well, at this stage, we now have a challenge. The architecture has completely changed. We have all of this data void with company data on personal devices that we would otherwise have asked people to bring to the office so that we could purge them, but we can't do that now. And so we just need to learn how to deal with that architecture, but that it's a moving target, right? And so because it's a moving target, I think that the fact that we would ask those questions from the board on a regular basis is key. I often say that security is a journey and it's not a destination. And it's a continuous journey. You get few pit stops along the way, but you can't stop for too long because things change all the time. And before, the attackers were changing their techniques. Now our attack surface is changing by the week, or sometimes by the day. And so it is a major challenge, but it is a strategic challenge. Make no mistake. It's not just a technical challenge for the security team. It's a strategic challenge for the board. And they need to rise up to that. And we have to make it easy for them by demystifying what needs to be done.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect comment, Matt, because ultimately you were correct in the beginning when you said we need to be speaking the language of the business. We talk about that a lot on this show, right? The security professionals need to break out of that, out of that shell of being a technical organization and being a strategic business organization. And I love the way you've laid out the 5 pillars and kind of some of the I'll call it the domains under each pillar, right? Because it allows for that communication barrier to be broken down. Because when you talk to someone on the board about, people security, right? Security of things like our contractor staff, our partners, the people who visit our organization, or if you talk about data security in the likelihood of, or under the umbrella of trade secrets, right? Our intellectual property, our employee data versus our customer data. That's the language of the business that they're going to understand. And then they're going to be able to make some level of risk evaluation on that, right? So, I'm a CISO who's very focused on risk. And that's my ability to have conversation with business unit leaders and the board and the leadership in my organization. And it's really communicating like that. It's communicating the language of the business and not getting too much in the details of the technical nuances.
Yeah, because we can lose them far too quickly with technical or legal jargon. And there's another concept that I cover in the book, which is what I call the 5 stages of cyber accountability. And it goes through the 5 stages of grief. So the first one is denial from the board, right? This doesn't apply to us. Our role is to grow the business, to make profits for shareholders. Then there's anger. Leave us alone. We appointed a CISO and they're doing a good job. We give them funding. They can do pen tests. They can buy firewalls and antivirus and that type of stuff. We don't need to know anything else. Bargaining. Oh, well, our competitors have been hacked. Maybe the regulator is sending us some letters asking what we're doing. So we'll just hire a big firm to come in, and so that we can say that big firm is actually auditing us. So we're clean, and that's a good start, but you're not clean. It doesn't actually answer the issue. Then there's depression. Oh my God, the regulator is at the door. We have been hacked. What do we do? And then acceptance. Well, it's our job to take corrective action. It's our job to show that actually we are probably doing 60 to 70% of what we're supposed to do. We just need to demonstrate that we are doing it, and we need to bridge that gap. And in order to bridge that gap, you're entirely right. We need to move away from the technology talk, because otherwise we lose them.
Yeah. And I think getting to a fast track of that acceptance stage without having to experience the breach is the goal of every CISO, right? Because we don't want them accepting it because they were forced to. Ultimately, it's influence and educate the organization so they get to that level of acceptance quicker.
Absolutely, and the CISO role is a very tough role, because it's a tough act, because if you do your job correctly, nobody knows your name. If something goes wrong, you're immediately in the line of fire. And that's also one of the reasons why I created the advisory board, because I felt that security and compliance people need to help each other, because they're definitely in the line of fire anytime that something goes wrong, even if it's completely unrelated to what they're doing.
And I think that's Jason, an important aspect. Oh, go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think the way you get them to acceptance faster is use the 5 pillars, right? Use the 5 components. Identify the gaps on where do you think it's important, where do you not. Use that as kind of like your baseline to try to educate the board. Like, guys, we're missing like these 3 pillars. We should really think about this and move them through that maturity cycle.
And Matt, what I was about to say is not just the board, all the other leaders in the organization as well. Because again, it's a shared responsibility across the organization. Matt said CISOs and risk folks and compliance folks have a target on their back. Well, when you take this methodology and you make it a shared responsibility across the entire organization, now everybody has skin in the game.
Absolutely, and that's why we have 2 different versions of the methodology. We've got one that is super strategic, but essentially is the basis, the fundamentals of what a security strategy should have. And then we've got one that's more operational, that the C-level folks and the key decision makers can use. And they because they're both based on the 5 pillars, and in fact the 25 questions in the super strategic version for board are actually repeated in the 60 question version for C-level folks. They actually end up talking the same data, and they have like a common point. They have like common data points upon which to build a strategy and to use as a basis for sometimes difficult discussions about how they may need to re-engineer a service or an application or whatever. But at least we're talking about the same stuff, and they can help each other.
Yes, that's great. Absolutely. Yeah. Mathieu, well, luckily you didn't have to fall back onto your book career. I think you've done pretty good on the cybersecurity side. I'd like to thank you for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you very much, guys. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you.
You're so welcome. We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.